Of course, ethics is not just one topic, and the philosophy of ethics is not just one topic. And perhaps it's best if we divide it into three different areas. So one area that philosophers are interested in is the status of ethical statements. So are they objective? If I say it's wrong to murder, is that an objective statement? Is it a subjective statement? And if it's subjective, what does that mean? Is it just a matter of opinion? Is it just my opinion? And if somebody else disagrees with me, that's just a difference of opinion, and there's no fact of the matter to ascertain who's right and who's wrong. And this is probably the toughest part of the philosophy of ethics, and people disagree about its status and how to try and ground ethics in some kind of objectivity. Clearly, ethical statements are not like statements about the physical world. If I say that chair over there has got four legs and is red, well, if I say that chair over there has got four legs and a back to it, so those are all the things about that chair that one can test, and one can go into a laboratory and one can measure the legs, and one can see that it has a back to it, and one can imagine, of course, if one leaves this room, that chair will still be there, and it's not dependent upon human beings for its existence. But morality is dependent on human beings. There's no sense that there could be morality if there were no human beings, or at least sentient creatures. We could make no sense of morality without any humans on the planet. There's no morality on the moon or on planet Mars because there are no sentient creatures there. So we need human beings to have morality. So there's clearly a difference there between morals and the kind of physical world. And one question is, well, how do we make sense then of morality being objective? If you ask students this, often their first reaction is to say, oh, morality is just a matter of opinion, it's just my opinion. But actually, most people don't believe that. And if you then listen to them during the course of the day, they'll get involved in a heated debate about morality. And it makes no sense to have a heated debate about morality unless you take it seriously, unless you think that you're right and somebody else is wrong, whether it's about politics or all sorts of topics. People actually believe that there is a right answer and that somebody else who disagrees with them is wrong in some kind of important sense, and it's not just an opinion. So how do you make sense of it? I mean, I quite like the analogy with colour in a way, in that this table in front of us is black, and if somebody says this table is pink, well, they're just wrong, they're making a mistake, they're colourblind or something like that. But if human beings disappear from this room and from this planet, it makes no sense to talk about redness where there are no sentient creatures here. You need people to be able to see something black. Without human beings, there's no such thing as colour. And I think there's probably an analogy there with morality. So without human beings, you can make no sense of morality, but you can still make mistakes about morality. I can make a mistake about the colour of that table. In any case, that's one big area, the status of morality and whether it's objective, whether it's subjective, and what those terms mean. That's one category of moral philosophy. Another big area of moral philosophy is how we should live. And there it makes sense traditionally to divide ethics into three areas. And there are three different broad approaches. Some people think that the boundaries are not as strict as other people, but traditionally how we should live has been, and how we should act has been divided into three different areas. There's a tradition going back all the way to Aristotle, now 2,500 years, which is that what's important is character. And one should act in the way that a good person would act. One should be generous in the way a generous person would act. One should exhibit the virtues of a virtuous person. And morality is to be understood in terms of character. There's another approach which has its roots in Kant, the 18th century, and Immanuel Kant, who was born in Königsberg. And Kant believed that we should act according to a certain set of moral rules, and that we shouldn't transgress those rules, and we should act in accordance with how everybody else would act. It's often been compared to the golden rule, and some elements of Christianity have things in common with Immanuel Kant. And I guess there are examples like lying or promise keeping. You shouldn't lie, because you should act in a way that everybody else should act, and you can't possibly wish that everybody lies. You should keep your promises and so on. And I guess the tradition of human rights that we have in the world at the moment owes a lot to Immanuel Kant and to what's called deontological ethics, that they are understood by a set of norms that shouldn't be transgressed. Torture is an example. You shouldn't torture people, no matter what the consequences are. And all sorts of other human rights are grounded in Immanuel Kant's philosophy, really. And I think we probably have Immanuel Kant, nobody realises this, but probably we have Immanuel Kant to thank for our modern conception of human rights. And then we jump forward another century or so to John Stuart Mill and to Jeremy Bentham. And these were British utilitarians. And John Stuart Mill believed that we should act according to what the best consequences were. Jeremy Bentham had a slightly cruder version of that. We should act according to that which maximises happiness. And you can see the tension there between Mill and Immanuel Kant. So where Kant said you shouldn't ever torture people, or you shouldn't lie, or you should always keep your promises, John Stuart Mill thought, well, if that produced the best consequences, then that was the right thing to do. So that sometimes it's the right thing to do to lie. Sometimes it's the right thing to do to fail to keep your promise. Sometimes, if necessary, it might be the right thing to do to torture somebody if there's a bomb about to be detonated and it's the only way you can find out where the bomb is, and there might be thousands of lives at stake. So those traditions are in conflict. They give different answers, really, about how we should act in certain circumstances. There are ways of trying to make them coincide. I think that most of us probably have strongly Kantian deontological instincts rather than utilitarian instincts, so that we, on the whole, don't think that consequences are all that matters. But often we take a quite more tolerant view about governments, for example, so that where individuals are interacting, we have quite Kantian attitudes, and we think that it's appalling if individuals treat each other in a non-deontological viewpoint. But when it comes to government, we think, well, maybe the government knows best. We're slightly more magnanimous and generous-spirited when it comes to the government, and we think, well, maybe the government might need to have to lie every now and again for the greater good, and the government has all our interests in common. So that's an intuition that some people share. Anyway, that's the second big category. So I've talked about meta-ethics, and I've talked about these different approaches about how to live. And then there's another part of ethics which is very practical, which doesn't look at the principles by which we live our lives. It draws on Kant, and it draws on Aristotle, and it draws on John Stuart Mill, but it looks very particularly at issues that cause us to disagree. in contemporary life. And so it might, for example, look at debates about abortion. It might address issues about capital punishment, euthanasia, all sorts of areas of our moral world that people disagree about. And philosophers have had a lot to say about all those areas. Charity is another example, who we should give to and how much we should give to. Again, it draws on those traditions that I was talking about. So a utilitarian, for example, would say that we are as much responsible for what we fail to do as for what we actually do. And one of the implications of that is that if we fail to give to people who are, for example, dying in the third world, we are just as responsible for that as if we actually send them poison. All that matters is the consequences. So we can draw no distinction between acting and failing to act. For myself, I'm particularly interested in dilemmas that are thrown up by advances in science. And I think these are particularly interesting because our intuitions often lag behind. So something will happen and science will invent something, and often we don't know how to respond to it. Or maybe our first response is a response of repugnance, disgust, and it takes us some time to get used to it. An example of that might be, for example, in vitro fertilization, which has been around for I don't know how long, but 15, 20 years now. And when it was first introduced, there were lots of voices saying how appalling, how disgusting, how unnatural it is that a baby could be created, as it were, outside the womb and then implanted in the womb. And now, at least in Britain, nobody thinks it's disgusting or repugnant, or very few people do. And it's just an accepted part of medical practice, and people are getting married later, having children later, and in vitro fertilization has been extremely important. Many of my friends have had children through in vitro fertilization, and nobody is, as I say, appalled or thinks that somehow they've acted immorally. But it took a long time for our intuitions to come to terms with that. And I think one of the ways in which philosophy can help, and moral philosophy can help, is to shortcut that process and to help people think about these new developments and to wonder whether they are things we should object to or not. And sometimes they might be things we should object to. Sometimes there might be developments in science. There may be developments of some kind of weapons that we think are abhorrent and should be stopped or controlled. And then other times we might think, well, even if your initial reaction is disgust, actually if you think about it a bit more carefully, well, who is harmed? Does it lead to a more inegalitarian society? If nobody's harmed, if it doesn't lead to a more inegalitarian society, well, what could be the objection to it? And let's try and pinpoint why it might be wrong. And we might not find nothing to object to, and we might think that despite our instinctive initial response to it and objection to it, in fact this is something that we should be neutral about, or indeed that we should embrace. So I think that's another area that philosophers can in fact be quite useful.